The people longed for a leader. In the circles of power, everyone thought it was about time they had a leader. So when Samuel the prophet called the nation together, everyone turned out to see what would happen. And when they saw the candidate, a young man, tall and handsome, they were all sold. Here was a leader they could respect and be proud of. But it was a complete disaster. King Saul was a self-serving man who lacked character and principle. The people were so unwise, they took a shine to his outward appearance. They told themselves that it would be all right. But in the end, Saul learnt from one to the next. It was a hard lesson for Israel to learn. Yet graciously, the Lord raised up David to be king in Israel. Several times we're told David was, healthy, but not a spectacular man. And if you read 1 Samuel 16, the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his outward appearance or the height of his stature, for the Lord sees not as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Leadership is important. It's always important. Good church leaders help focus a church on its mission and life, while bad leaders are still leading in some way. Remember our series in 1 Timothy. It's like listening to a phone call between the apostle and the pastor troubleshooter, Timothy, in the city of Ephesus. Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, that he wants Timothy to teach the church how they ought to behave in the household of God. This is what we're calling our series The Dream Church. Whether we're gathering on Sunday or whether we're scattered during the week to all our various places, Christians live as the church. And we're letting 1 Timothy inform us and shape our thinking about how we ought to live, the kind of lives we live. What kind of church will we be in 10 years' time? What needs to change for us to be the dream church? What do we need to stop and start to be the dream church? 1 Timothy's helping us figure that out. Reading the Bible as a church is not a theoretical exercise, not a pie-in-the-sky ideal thing. No, Jesus always is enlisting his people to learn to engage in the lives he has for them. For his glory. Last week we considered eldership in chapter 3 for the spiritual oversight and leading of the church. Jesus gives local churches elders to be those spiritual guardians for a congregation. Elders will give an account to Jesus for the role they play as his under-shepherds as they fight for grace to be central in the life of a church. Alongside eldership, and in our passage that we've read today, Paul gives instructions to Timothy about deacons. But what are deacons? Are deacons little elders that don't quite make being elders? or are deacons, what kind of do they play? Why doesn't our church have deacons? That'll be a good question to think about. Well, I hope to answer these questions and more as we think about our passage this morning. I trust the outline is helpful for you in the bulletin. As you see at the bottom of the bulletin, I've actually given you a definition, a working definition of what a deacon is. Deacons take a lead in showing the love of Christ through a ministry of mercy that addresses the needs of people in the household of God and beyond. I know, that's a mouthful, but it's written down so you can think about it. I trust the outline's helpful for you. Some of you have got transcripts. But this morning as I was reading through, I noticed a couple of mistakes, which I've fixed, but your copies don't have the mistakes fixed, so you'll have to keep an eye out for those. Really, our whole discussion this morning is about the dream church being merciful and being led by deacons in a ministry of mercy to one another. Let's have a go. We're looking at the first thing, what are deacons and why do they matter? That's our question. To be fair, there's only a handful of New Testament references that talk about deacons. It's an important role. To answer the question, what are deacons and why do they matter, we'll need to look at other parts of the Bible first to build an answer. So our first port of call is Philippians chapter 1. You can see it up on the screen. In the opening verse, Paul addresses deacons. He addresses his letter to the saints in Christ in Philippi, and he acknowledges the overseers, the elders, we talked about that last week, and deacons, and he does so separately. The church in Philippi is about 10 years old at this stage, having been a church plant. It was established, and now it's functioning with elders and deacons in place. And Paul mentions them separately. They are not the same role, they're different roles. The next passage we're turning to is Acts chapter 6. And Acts chapter 6 helps us identify our biblical priority and pattern that distinguishes the difference between elders and deacons in a helpful way. Now, do you remember the scene in Acts chapter 6? I'm hoping the writing's large enough for you. The fledgling church in Jerusalem is experiencing growing pains. There are thousands of new believers, and inevitably within the church, because of all the people, there are needs. We know from Acts chapter 4 that church members were giving generously to meet the needs of people. It's normal for Christian communities to do that. In Acts 6, we discover there's a complaint. We don't know if it was blatant racism or just unthoughtful negligence. Either way, as you look in the verses there, ethnic Greek widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of bread. Now, the apostles who were leading, eldering the church, don't ignore this complaint. In verse 2, they summon the full number of the disciples to a congregational meeting, and they lead the church to think through the complaint, the situation, and notice the priority and the pattern they highlight. In verse 2, the apostles are unwilling to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. And in verse 3, they ask the congregational meeting to identify 7 men for appointment so they can take on responsibility for the daily distribution of bread. The apostles, the elders, they're eldering, overseeing the church, are governing the life and direction of the church. And if you look at verse 6, we see the 7 men are publicly commissioned to serve this need. So the widows aren't overlooked. I trust you can see the pattern. At verse 4, the apostles say, we will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word. And they're not suggesting that serving food is beneath them. No, this is the difference between a good thing and the best thing. It's good to serve food and make sure no one is overlooked, their needs are cared for, but it's best for the spiritual health of the church and for Jesus' ongoing mission in the world if elders are devoted to prayer and the ministry of the word. And other qualified people serve the needs of people within the church. And if you notice in verse 7 of that reading, by word and prayer, the good news of Jesus is spreading. People are being converted. The mission of the church is ongoing. Imagine a sea captain in command of a vessel of over 2,000 people. If he and all his high-ranking officers left the bridge of the ship to serve as cooks in the cook mess below, the whole ship would be bobbing along without any purposeful direction. No one in charge. It's good that everyone has food, but they are far more likely to run aground because the leading officers are neglecting their main calling. The elders are to be the spiritual overseers of the local church. Elders are to teach and preach the word for the souls of those in their care. That's the cornerstone of their calling. They're not to neglect it. We're seeing that principle set out for us in Acts 6. For clarity, Acts 6 does not call the 7 men deacons, so we need to be careful, but it is pointing us to what deacons do in some way, and we'll think about that. We'll look at the qualifications for deacons in a moment. One notable difference between elders and deacons is the fact that deacons are not required to teach sound doctrine. But in Acts 6, that helps us identify a biblical priority and pattern for the church that distinguishes the role of elders and deacons. And I think that's helpful for us. So what are deacons? Well, a brief word study helps us kind of zero in a little. The basic meaning of the word deacon means to serve, as in a servant. As this word's used in all kinds of different ways in the New Testament. Jesus in Matthew 20 says, "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, must be your deacon." Likewise, when the Apostle Paul's outlining the role of governing authorities in Romans 13, he teaches us that they are instituted by God. And speaking of the governing authorities, he said, "He is God's servant for your good," literally, deacon for your good. Acts 6 has shown us that the community will have physical needs from time to time, and so the idea of a deacon is helping and caring for people in the household of God, and even beyond, as there might be opportunities to do that. What kind of needs might a deacon be serving? Well, remember Jesus' words in Matthew 25. Often this passage is misread, but let's try and read it well. Jesus is anticipating eternal outcomes at the end of time, when judgment comes. The sheep, Jesus' true people, have found themselves occupied through life. They served the church community as they lived. The hungry were fed, the thirsty were given drink, strangers were given invitations and hospitality, those needing clothing were clothed, the sick were cared for. This is what Christians were busy with. The imprisoned were not forgotten, but cared for. That was all done for those within the household of God. Love for one another was love for Christ. And Jesus is acknowledging this, and he's saying that's what it'll be like on the last day. I'll see that you've done it. And from what Jesus says, we can see that from time to time, hunger, thirst, alienation, nakedness, sickness, even imprisonment are the things that leave disciples of Jesus in need of help and care as we live in this not right world. Deacons take up a role that leads in coordinating that help and care, that addresses the needs within the household of God. Perhaps the best way of thinking about this is shock absorbers. You know, you've probably seen those big four-wheel drives with their lift kits and their big shock absorbers rolling along the road. And for them, it's all about clearance from the rough spots. You don't want to be bottoming out and hitting the bump with a thump. So you have good shock absorbers that help avoid the blows or stop the thumps being as hard as they might be. That's what a deacon is to be like. We all live in this not right world where all kinds of troubles can wash into our lives and we don't always manage in life. Deacons, on behalf of the church family and with the resources supplied by the church family, endeavour to bring real help and care, to be shock absorbers that mercifully lessen the blows in life. Deacons take the lead in working out what Galatians 6:10 says. And Paul says, "As we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." Yes, all Christians are called to do good. This is for all of us. John says, "If anyone has the world's good and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him?" That doesn't compute. Yet deacons are appointed and could be appointed to take the lead in mercy ministry on behalf of the church to our church family or even beyond. I know a lot of government agencies offer all kinds of services and help to people, which is great that they do that. And that is in large part a legacy of Christian faith and its influence on society over the centuries. But a healthy church should not let government agencies rob them of the opportunity of doing good. As we are able, as there are opportunities, as time and treasure and talents allow, we should serve and care and help those in need. And deacons provide some structure and leadership to this mercy ministry within the life of the church. Making some sense? This is what deacons are. This is why they're needed. So, who should be deacons? Well, Paul gives us a list of qualifications in our passage, 1 Timothy 3. A list of qualifications that help us identify those who we might entrust this role to. Yes, every Christian is called to serve, to be someone who's merciful, but it doesn't mean everyone's entrusted with the office of being a deacon, given the leadership role. Now, as we look at the qualifications, the overwhelming focus, like elders, was on the established exemplary character of the people. And if you give it a moment's thought, why that would be needed, well, when people are vulnerable, when people are hurting, when they're at their wits' end, when they're facing difficulties in life, we don't ask the bull to enter the china shop and make a bigger mess, do we? We want people of exemplary character. And so verse 8 in our passage, worthy of respect. That is that's the above reproach idea. They're not given to being inappropriate or foolish. They're sincere. They don't say one thing one moment and then another thing to someone else. Not double-tongued. Sincerity is about faithfulness too. Deacons are trustworthy people. And like elders, deacons are not to be addicted to alcohol or money. Yes, alcohol can and does control some people's lives. And Paul says it disqualifies them from being a deacon leader. And imagine we were thinking of appointing someone as a deacon, but they were greedy. Well, the temptation for dishonest gain might get the better of them when they're handling finances, congregation finances. Like Judas, they might fiddle the till to their own advantage, or might fall foul of that. The deacons are known as transparent and trustworthy people. That's what Paul's saying. Now, in answering who should be a deacon, notice two key issues in verses 9 and 10 in our passage. Firstly, verse 9, a deacon must be a real Christian believer. They must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith, says Paul. Remember, we learned in chapter 1 that sound doctrine, knowing the gospel right, grows sound conduct, real gospel lives. The message of saved by grace in Christ is the deep truth Paul's talking about that shapes our lives. For instance, if you fail to grasp how generously God has been in lavishing his free grace upon your undeserving life, you'll probably find a corner of your thinking willing to resist active generosity towards people you imagine are undeserving of your generosity, because grace is not informing you as it might. So deacons must get the gospel, and they hold to the truth of the Christian faith. Deacons are not asked to be able to teach sound doctrine like elders, but they should agree with it in a good conscience. I didn't mention this last week, but in Presbyterian churches, elders subscribe to what we call the Westminster Confession of Faith. The Confession of Faith is an understanding, or our understanding, of what the Bible teaches, a summary of what the Bible teaches. We're a confessional church with a system of doctrine that elders teach. Deacons don't need to teach the Westminster Confession of Faith, but they should agree with it with a clear conscience and be able to, well, it seems to me, as we think about these verses, what Paul is saying of a deacon is that in their serving and dealing with people, they would never consciously undermine the sound doctrine being taught in the congregation. The second issue there is verse 10. Paul says they must first be tested, and then there'll be nothing against them. If there's nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. Testing is about having a go, developing commitments and doing things well, isn't it? That testing sees people face challenges or difficulties and prove themselves under some degree of pressure. And in Acts 6, the 7 men appointed had a track record. They were known to the church, and so they were given the role. The congregation had confidence because there was nothing against them. That's why they asked them to be leaders in what they were asked to do and to serve. And again, if you glance down to verse 12, like with elders, managing a household and relationships within the family is the natural testing ground of Christian faith and life. Faithfulness in smaller things at home trains and equips you for taking on bigger responsibilities in the church family as a deacon. And if there's nothing against them, let them serve as deacons, says Paul. One big question in all of this, of who can be deacons, is can women serve as deacons? When we read our translation, that we've got our blue Bibles here, the 84 NIV, at first glance it reads like women cannot be deacons. You know, verse 8 in our passage, deacons likewise are to be men worthy of respect. And in verse 12, a deacon must be the husband of but one wife. And looking at verse 11, the NIV leads us to think that deacon men must have really, really good godly wives. I confess a good part of my preparation focused on answering this question, can women be deacons? Why so much time spent on this? Well, translation decisions need to be made with verse 11. Without wanting to get all too technical on you, the words their wives have some issues. In the Greek, there, the word there, is not present, and it's added to make sense of our English sentence. And the word translated wives can equally be translated women. Greek grammar doesn't solve which way you should translate it or write it in English. The good and faithful Bible readers land in different places. Some say wives, some say women. What it means is this: the alternate reading of women likewise opens the possibility that verse 11, that Paul is there, he's not describing the character of a male deacon's wife, but he's actually describing a woman who's serving as a deacon. To get to the bottom of this verse and the question, can women be deacons, it's helpful to ask, why does Paul write verse 11? Why is Paul screening the character of these women? I think that question's a helpful pointer. Let me list some of the points in support of verse 11, opening the door for the office of deacon to women. Last week, there was no specific qualification or disqualification for an elder based on the character of his wife. So why would Paul create a higher bar for deacons? I know it's an silence, but it seems to be a point in discussion. Paul likewise uses likewise in verse 8 to introduce his description of deacons, and he uses it again in verse 11. The phrase "in the same way" in our verse 11 in our Bibles, in the Greek, is the same word likewise used in verse 8, suggesting that verse 11 can be about women deacons. The main thrust of 1 Timothy 3 is the focus on the conduct of life in the household of God. So in broader context, verse 11 can be read as the conduct of women deacons. And given the role of mercy ministry, you would not want malicious talkers or intemperate or untrustworthy women serving in that role. Notice also that verse 11 has character qualities that are present in male elders and male deacons. Verse 8, worthy of respect. Verse 11, worthy of respect. In chapter 3, verse 2, elders are to be temperate. But now in verse 11, women are to be temperate. And so men are in view in verses 8 to 10. And again they're in view, clear view, verses 12 to 13. Some people object that verse 11 is just dropped nowhere, and so they can't imagine Paul opening the door for women to be deacons. But whatever view you take on how you translate wives or women, verse 11 is like a one-verse interruption in the flow of what's been said. So I go back to the question, why is Paul screening the character of these women? And I think Paul expects the church will identify women from time to time who are qualified to serve as deacons. Given that we understand what eldership is, and that spiritual authority is entrusted to those qualified men, and given that we know elders and deacons are not the same office, they're different roles, there need not be any confusion or concern in permitting women to serve as deacons. And it seems to me the church in Rome had no issue with this either. We read from Romans 16 earlier where Paul mentions Phoebe. He says, I commend your sister Phoebe, a servant. Yeah, there's that word again, a deacon of the church. Yes, Paul might use servant without thinking of the office of deacon. That's possible. But in verse 2 we learn that Phoebe has been a great help to many people. The idea is more literally patron of many. And it lends weight to verse 1 in a recognition of her official role. And verse 1 does say, deacon of the church. It looks like Phoebe enjoys public recognition in her role. And so we must not forget also, in the New Testament, women like Tabitha in Acts 9, who were active in serving the needs of people within the church. And of course, there are times when it's only appropriate for women to minister to women. Another good reason for having women deacons. In 2 Timothy 3, Paul highlights a problem where men are leading women astray, and really a woman ought to be present perhaps in the room. And if you take time to read 1 Timothy 5, you'll find there's much about ministry to women. And it's appropriate for ladies to be ministering to the needs of ladies. And having qualified women to serve as deacons seems biblical and wise. One question, as we're thinking about all these things, but some people might be wondering, is our board of management, are they deacons or not? No, they're not. Board managers do some administrative that are deacon-like service, but they're not tasked with caring for the needs in the church, like we're reading and thinking about this morning. Why doesn't our church have deacons? That's a good question. Well, I confess, in my 30-ish years in the Prezi church, this office has been, I think, much neglected. I'm not sure of all the history here at Grace in Wodonga, but from what I know, we've been deaconless for much of, or perhaps even all of our life. And Grace, Wodonga, Life and Mission may well be impoverished because we're not identifying qualified deacons to serve and take a lead in mercy ministry. Should we have deacons? Well, I reckon we should, and I reckon perhaps after the service we should have a discussion about it. I'd love to hear from you and what you think about this. One thing is for sure, and we'll finish with this idea, you'll see it in verse 13, there is great blessing received as we serve others. Verse 13, Paul says, those who have served well gain an excellent standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. When we serve Jesus, there is a living gospel dynamic that is worked out in our lives. When deacons serve well, Paul says, they gain a good standing. Yes, to some degree, good service builds a reputation, that kind of a standing, trust and confidence, and that's a good thing. But Paul's not just talking about that kind of standing, public reputation and acclaim. Can you see good standing in verse 13 is linked with the idea of great assurance in their faith? Puritan John Flavel once said, obedience is the road to assurance. And that's what this verse is talking about. Obedience is the road to assurance. Good works do not save anyone, but faith without works is dead. And a living gospel connection exists where obedience to Jesus is the road to great assurance in our faith. And we know this is true because Jesus did nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. The Son of Man did not demand to be served, but he served and gave his life a ransom for many. Jesus humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. And he took the low road of service, and God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name above all names. And the more we comprehend that Jesus did this for us and for our salvation, the more we'll be moved to serve him and to serve others like Jesus served us, and to actually know the road of obedience that leads to great assurance. So, do you know Christ rather than know about him? That's key. Do you know Jesus made himself nothing so that you could be everything to God? See, when the truth about Jesus is personal, will you be drawn into a changed life that obeys God? What will allow you to sacrifice time and energy for others? What helps you give to people's needs? Why would someone want to serve as a deacon and sacrifice time for showing mercy to people? Well, it's Jesus in the end. Yes, there are inner fears that will plead with us to protect our possessions. Fears often want us to bargain, to limit, avoiding interruptions to our comfortable lives. But Jesus' perfect love casts out those fears. And as we serve, we receive the blessing of great assurance that we belong to Jesus' saved people. There's a blessing in serving. The Dream Church is a community where all kinds of people find help and hope because we care like Jesus cares. The Dream Church is a community where people find comfort and care because Jesus comforts and cares. The Dream Church needs deacons. The Dream Church needs people, all people in us, ministering in mercy, not only to spare elders from being diverted and neglecting the word of ministry and prayer, but deacons take the lead in showing the love of Christ and addressing the needs in the household of God. Deacons help us become a church of mercy, reflecting the very life of Christ, being the church Jesus calls us to be. And that's what our passage teaches us. And so we get to roll up our sleeves as Christians, living lives of mercy and care and help, because we know the mercy and care and help of Christ. And that's at work, changing us, shaping our church to be the Dream Church that he calls us to be. Let me pray.